The Western powers held a conference in Switzerland in June, and they tried to get international support for Ukraine in an effort to win its war with Russia. However, this conference completely failed. 160 countries were invited, but only 90 agreed to attend, and the majority of them did not send high-level officials. And among the 90 that attended, only 78 ended up signing the final agreement, and the vast majority of the countries that signed that agreement were the Western countries themselves, along with their allies and proxies like Japan and South Korea, and just a small handful of countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America joined the West. These were largely governments that are essentially puppet regimes of the West. On the other hand, the countries representing roughly 80% of the entire world's population did not sign this joint declaration that was agreed to at this Ukraine conference in Bürgenstock, Switzerland, which was held on June 15th and June 16th. Even Switzerland, which hosted the conference, admitted that it was a failure in an article that was published by Swiss state media titled "Ukraine Peace Summit Failed to Meet Fairy Tale Expectations." The article noted that the world's media has given a mixed reaction to the summit, which, quote, was rejected by several key countries. It noted that among the countries that did not endorse the joint declaration were India, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and Brazil, and Russia and China were not present because Russia was not even invited to this so-called peace summit, which actually was not a peace summit because only one side of the war was invited. The major US media outlet CNBC also essentially acknowledged that the conference was a failure. As CNBC put it, Ukraine summit lacked clout. It's another way of saying it was not seen as important. And this report noted that 160 countries were invited, but only 90 ended up actually attending. And the Associated Press, the AP, pointed out that only 78 countries ended up agreeing to the joint statement. And I should point out that 78 still might sound like a lot, but this included many tiny countries like, for instance, Andorra or Liechtenstein or Malta, all of which are smaller than a small town in China. I mean, these are tiny little city-states essentially, and also Palau, which is a tiny island nation. So even 78 makes it sound like much more than it actually was. In reality, again, countries representing around 80% of the world population did not sign the joint declaration. And the Associated Press pointed out that the conference was, quote, marked by the absence of Russia, which was not invited. So again, it's not actually a peace summit. By definition, it cannot be a peace summit if one side of the war is not invited to negotiate peace. In reality, it was a Ukraine war summit. And the Associated Press, the most mainstream of US media outlets, noted that mostly Western countries attended the conference. That's an exact quote. It was mostly Western countries. The AP added that India, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Thailand, and the United Arab Emirates did not sign the final document. Brazil, which was an observer, did not sign, and China did not attend. Now, what's important is all of these countries that did not sign are either BRICS members or have expressed interest in joining BRICS. And they actually represent the global majority, not the Western powers, which are only about 14% of the world population, but they act as though they represent the world majority. In fact, Ukraine's NATO-backed leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, he made a very arrogant and even racist comment at this summit that showed how completely out of touch the Ukrainian leadership is with the rest of the world. This was published by the Ukrainian media outlet UNN, which is a Ukrainian state-backed media. And this report quoted Zelensky, who said that, quote, all of the participants of the summit, the majority of the world, this gives a powerful support for Ukraine. It's objectively false that it was the majority of the world. It was not the majority of the world. And then this is the extremely racist part. Zelensky said, quote, as soon as Brazil and China join the principles that all of us here, civilized countries, have united, we will be happy to hear their opinions, sometimes even if they do not coincide with the majority of the world. This is incredible on so many levels. First of all, it is objectively false that it's the majority of the world. It's not the majority of the world. It's the West. Secondly, Zelensky, the NATO-backed ruler in Ukraine, he's claiming that China and Brazil are not civilized because they do not go along with the West and obediently follow with what the Western colonial powers tell them to do. This shows how this colonialist arrogance continues in the West. Zelensky represents this parochial, racist, condescending attitude in which the Western powers that colonized and enslaved the majority of the world, they're arrogantly telling the vast majority of the world population in the global South to follow our orders. And if you don't follow us, you're not civilized. This is just white supremacy. This is what Ukraine and NATO and the United States and Europe represent. Colonialism and racism. They do not represent the world majority. It's the exact opposite. They represent a tiny minority of the world. And this map that I created here that shows the countries that agreed to this final declaration clearly demonstrates how isolated they are, but they are caught in a bubble that they created, and they truly do not understand how out of touch they are. Here I am looking at the joint statement that was published on the official website of the Swiss Foreign Ministry. This is the joint statement from June 16th, 2024, and it was signed in Bürgenstock, Switzerland, which is why it's known as the Bürgenstock Declaration. And by the way, Bürgenstock is a mountain in Switzerland, and this conference was held at a resort there. And what's funny is that resort is actually owned by the Qatari monarchy, by the government of Qatar, and it was previously owned by the Swiss bank UBS, but they sold it to the Qatari monarchy. So this joint statement has the list of the 78 countries that signed. And by the way, among the countries that signed was Israel, as it's carrying out crimes against humanity in Gaza with Western support. It was invited to this so-called peace conference, which again shows how much of a joke this fake peace conference was. It actually was not about peace. It was about trying to get more international support for Ukraine to wage war against Russia. And you can see, if you look at the list, the vast majority of the countries that signed were European countries. And again, they include many tiny little European states like Andorra, Liechtenstein, Malta, Luxembourg, and they also added signatures from the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the European Commission, the European Council, and the European Parliament to make it look like there are more signatories. This is how desperate they were to pretend like they had more international support. And one of the main reasons that so few countries agreed to sign this declaration is it was because it was completely one-sided and it blamed the war only on Russia. The first line of the declaration is, quote, the ongoing war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. No mention of the fact that this is a war between NATO and Russia in Ukrainian territory. No mentioning of the fact that the whole reason this war started is because Russia was surrounded by NATO, because NATO and the Western powers violated the agreements they made with the former Soviet Union and with Russia in the 1990s. They continued expanding eastward. They continued building military bases surrounding Russia. The US backed a coup that overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected government in 2014, setting off this civil war in Ukraine. And none of this is mentioned. Instead, the joint statement simply blames everything on Russia, which is why so few countries endorsed it. And you know what's also funny? This joint declaration is very short. And the irony is that the other points of the declaration, which call for no attacks on nuclear installations, which call for securing global food security, it calls for exchanging and releasing prisoners of war and respecting the UN Charter. That should all sound pretty familiar because basically what this joint declaration did is it took some of the points that China made back in February 2023, over a year ago, in China's peace plan for Ukraine. But China's peace plan was much more comprehensive. China introduced 12 different points. So instead, what the Western powers did is they took just a small part of this Chinese peace plan, and then they added that declaration blaming everything on Russia. This was pointed out on Twitter by the great French analyst Arnaud Bertrand. He pointed out that 6 of the 12 points that China made in its February 2023 peace plan were introduced again, basically stolen, in this Western so-called peace plan. And he pointed out that instead, the West removed all of the substance, all of the meat from this Chinese peace proposal, including the call for a cessation of hostilities, including a call to resume peace talks, including a call to abandon the Cold War mentality, including a call to end unilateral sanctions, and a call for reconstruction. The West removed all of that and just made this very anodyne statement, blaming everything on Russia. And as Arnaud pointed out, he said, this comes almost 1.5 years after the Chinese peace plan, which the West had rejected immediately out of hand. And ironically, the West claimed that China's peace proposal was vague, even though the outcome of the Swiss summit is actually more vague. And by the way, just a few weeks before this Swiss summit was held, China and Brazil had jointly introduced another peace proposal, and they called for an international peace conference featuring equal participation of all parties that is recognized by both Russia and Ukraine. And the rest of their peace proposal was essentially also accepted at this Western so-called peace summit where Russia was not invited. So again, we see that in reality, what's happening is that the Western powers are opposing China's numerous peace plans. This is the second time in roughly a year that China has introduced a peace plan, and the West has rejected that, and instead, they introduced their own so-called peace plan where Russia was not invited to participate, and it's completely watered down and vague and doesn't actually call for peace in any way. It doesn't call for ending the war. All it calls for is maintaining complete territorial integrity in Ukraine, making sure that Ukraine does not lose an inch of territory, which of course is a complete non-starter for Russia because the Russian majority regions in the east of Ukraine and the Donbass already had referenda in which the majority of people said that they wanted to join Russia. It's a complete non-starter. The West knows that Russia will never agree to their so-called peace agreement, which is why the West opposed these numerous peace plans made by China and did its own fake peace conference that a small percentage of the world actually agreed to. But Western governments are so out of touch with reality. And we saw this with a ridiculous report. It's almost laughable. An article that was published by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. This is a US state propaganda outlet. It was created by the CIA as a propaganda organ during the first Cold War. The day after the conference ended, this US propaganda outlet published an article titled, "After Ukraine Peace Summit, question remains whether Russia will come to the table." Russia was not even invited to the table. China and Brazil and Mexico and several other countries have called for an international peace conference where both Ukraine and Russia are able to sit at the table. And the West has rejected those calls. Instead, the West held this fake peace summit where Russia was not invited to the table. And now their propaganda media outlets are asking if Russia will come to the table that it was not invited to. I mean, What planet do these people live on? It's absolutely remarkable. And Reuters, another mainstream media outlet in the West based in the UK, which historically has been funded by the British government, it was to spread propaganda during the First Cold War. Reuters published a hilarious article that cited anonymous diplomats, obviously from the West, who complained that China was pushing a rival Ukraine peace plan before the Swiss summit. And they acted as though China was supposedly trying to undermine the Western peace plan, which is not a peace plan, because you cannot have a peace plan to end a war if one side of the war is not invited to negotiate. It literally, by definition, is not a peace plan. So the article, this should be titled instead, China pushes real Ukraine peace plan as alternative to Swiss war summit. That would be an actually accurate title. For over 2 years now, Beijing has constantly been calling for peace, saying we are willing to negotiate peace, to have peace talks. Or if another country like Brazil or Mexico or Turkey does it, we will support their efforts. And the day the conference ended, the Swiss summit, the day it ended, the Chinese media published a report noting that China once again is calling for Russia-Ukraine peace talks as soon as possible. The entire world can see what country actually wants peace. It's China. And the vast majority of the world can see that it's the West that does not actually want peace. They only want Ukraine to win on their conditions, which is not peace. They want their side of the war to win because they are directly involved in this war. It is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. It is a war between Russia and NATO, led by the US, and it's happening in Ukrainian territory, but the Western powers are directly implicated. And even mainstream Western media outlets have admitted in numerous reports that Western special operations forces from the militaries of the US, the UK, and European nations are on the ground in Ukraine. They are directly involved in this war. And yet again, they act as though it is simply just evil Russia against democracy and human rights. The final thing that I want to look at today in this analysis is the comments that were made by Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, because I think he represents the view of the majority of the world in the global south that truly want peace and they do not want this war to continue. The Colombian president said that he was invited to the so-called peace summit in Switzerland, but he denied, he rejected the invitation. And why? Petro said, quote, "What we have found is that the conference is basically an alignment of one side of the war." So it's not a peace conference. He said, we are not in agreement with that. And he said, quote, "Latin America does not want more war. It wants peace as soon as possible." And then in follow-up remarks, in a long statement published on Twitter, Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, said that the forum in Switzerland, quote, "is not a free forum to discuss the paths to peace between Russia and Ukraine. Its conclusions are already predetermined." So he's saying, again, this is not a real peace summit. He said, quote, "The majority of Latin America and the government of Colombia are not in agreement with extending the war. We do not subscribe to political blocs for war." And he announced, "I am suspending my trip to the meeting in Switzerland, and I ask that Europe debates the paths to end the war and not to extend it." He said, "Dialogue between Russia and Ukraine is fundamental. The establishment of a security zone without nuclear arms that separates physically NATO from Russia is a precondition." I repeat, this is very important. The president of Colombia, while calling for peace, he says that if we truly want peace, one of the preconditions has to be the establishment of a security zone with no nuclear weapons that physically separates NATO from Russia. And by the way, at the same time, as always, he called for the end to the G crime, G-side, against the Palestinian people being carried out by Israel with Western support. And Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, has always been very outspoken in support of Palestine. He represents the views of most people in the global south. The vast majority of the world population does not support the West's war efforts in Ukraine. They truly want peace to end this war, and they're very frustrated by the hypocrisy and the cynicism of the Western powers led by the US, which claim that they supposedly want peace, but in reality, they have been doing everything they can from the beginning of this war, before the war even began. The Western powers have done everything to try to prevent peace and instead continue to escalate the war to try to weaken Russia, which is their goal. Their goal is not peace. Their goal is to weaken and eventually try to overthrow the government of Russia. US President Joe Biden himself admitted this in March 2022 in a speech he gave in Poland while rallying more Western support for Ukraine. Biden said that Russian President Vladimir Putin, quote, cannot remain in power. The US president openly called for overthrowing the government of Russia. You cannot negotiate peace while you are calling for overthrowing the government of one side of the war while you are giving billions of dollars of weapons to the other side. No one with a straight face can claim that the US actually wants peace. It's Washington that is the principal obstacle to peace, not only in Ukraine, but in the entire world. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I'm Ben Norton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please share this. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.